If you go back to the turn of the 20th century, in 1908, there was a book published about the scourge of this massive army of lobbyists. And then in the 1920s, the 1940s, 1960s, every generation goes through an alarm discovery about how there's an explosion of lobbying. And that's been going on for over 100 years.
There are so many things wrong with our society. Everyone believes that our country is moving in the wrong direction. They believe it for one reason or another, but the root cause of this is that our elected representatives aren't representing the people alone. They are representing a few well-organized, very well-financed interests.
We cannot get any of our priorities through unless we fix our democracy and unless we fix the way, the role that money plays in our politics.
In 2014, the top 100 donors to super PACs spent almost as much as all 4.75 million small donors combined.
Is there any country that is comparable to the US in terms of the amount of money spent in relation to elections?
No.
Well, not even close.
No, not close.
Because in my view, the critical problem is not that corporations can speak, or that money is speech, or that there's lots of money spent on negative ads. The critical problem is we've outsourced the funding of campaigns to the tiniest fraction of the 1%.
So what's often said is the first primary, or the first election a candidate tries to win is the money election over their opponent. If they can outraise their opponent significantly, they have an enormous advantage. That's not healthy to our democracy.
There's some people that just can't raise enough money to mount a credible campaign. And there's other people who are able to raise a lot of money. And you can't raise a lot of money from poor people. You can only raise a lot of money by going where the money is. It's like they say, you have to fish where the fishes are.
So we know that the shortage of female politicians biases public policy against the interests of women. We know that the shortage of racial and ethnic minorities going into political office biases policies on racial issues. And we know, likewise, that the shortage of politicians from the working class biases economic policy in favor of the interests of the most privileged Americans. Government by the rich is often government for the rich, and government for the rich is often bad for everybody else.
Well, the history of campaign finance reform really is very similar to a game of whack-a-mole. So the way it usually begins is there's lots of money that gets into politics. After that money gets into politics, there's usually some type of scandal. After the scandal, there's a public outcry. And then there's this desire for reform. And legislators have to respond, of course, to the public outcry. It tends to follow that pattern. And you could go all the way back to the early 1900s to see that in play. So 1904, the presidential campaign of Theodore Roosevelt, there are allegations that his campaign has accepted improper donations from some of the big industrialists of the time. And the outcry to that leads to one of the first major campaign finance reform bills, the Tillman Act of 1907. What's ironic about the Tillman Act is that Theodore Roosevelt, who is the center of the scandal, actually backs campaign finance reform. So he's one of the earliest champions, even though he's at the center of a controversy. So the Tillman Act is passed, and what it does is it restricts and prohibits campaign contributions from corporations and interstate banks to federal candidates.
The Tillman Act, which was kind of one of our first campaign finance laws, and the Tillman Act was passed in 1907, and it basically prohibited congressionally chartered corporations and banks from spending money to influence elections, to contribute to political campaigns.
In the early 1920s, there's a major scandal called the Teapot Dome scandal, in which a member of Warren Harding's administration in the Interior Department accepts a bribe, and it's a major scandal. In fact, it leads to the Interior Secretary going to prison for bribery. So there's again a scandal, a public outcry, and Congress responds with the Federal Corrupt Practices Act of 1925.
There was another later act called the Taft-Hartley Act that passed a few decades later, which also prevented labor unions and other corporations, including nonprofit corporations, from spending money to influence elections. That was the setup for up until roughly, the 1970s. So fast forward to 1971, Congress wanted to update these campaign finance laws. It passed the Federal Election Campaign Act. And then we had this scandal called Watergate. One part of the story that a lot of people are familiar with are the Watergate burglars who broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters of the Watergate Hotel and were snooping and finding all kinds of information about their opponents.
But what a lot of people forget is that there was money involved, hush money that was paid to the Watergate burglars that had come through the committee to re-elect the president.
That spurred action to update that law, and Congress passed a new law in 1974 that went a little further.
And the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974, the amendments in 1974, did some really significant things. The first and most important was, for the first time in American history, campaign finance laws now had an independent regulatory agency, the Federal Election Commission.
The FEC, which is a commission of 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, is the commission that oversees our campaign finance laws and is supposed to enforce them.
This is one of the most important government agencies that Americans don't know about. The FEC was created post-Watergate to deal with particularly presidential campaign finances, and it also deals with all congressional finances. And it monitors our campaigns, how our campaigns are run with the finances. All expenditures and contributions are reported to the Federal Election Commission by candidates, and they're supposed to monitor and make sure that everybody plays by the same rules. And they're doing a lousy job of it, frankly.
The former chair of the FEC, who just stepped down at the end of 2015, they each have 1-year terms, she essentially said in the New York Times that there would not be much enforcement in the 2016 presidential campaign, and that not only is the Federal Election Commission dysfunctional, she said, and she's the chair, it's worse than dysfunctional, worse than dysfunctional.
This is the chairwoman of the Federal Election Commission speaking with the New York Times over the weekend. Quote, "The likelihood of the laws being enforced is slim."
I never want to give up, but I'm not under any illusions. People think the FEC is dysfunctional. It's worse than dysfunctional.
It's worse than dysfunctional. That is the chair of the FEC saying the laws they're supposed to enforce about money in politics during this upcoming election, with unprecedented amounts of money being poured into politics, there's very little chance those laws are going to be enforced.
New York Times says some commissioners are now barely on speaking terms. Cross-aisle negotiations are infrequent, and with no consensus on which rules to enforce, the caseload against violators has plummeted.
Unfortunately, we've seen a very polarized commission in recent years, where you have 3-3 splits between the Republicans and the Democrats, and when that happens, there's no action.
It's because it's really, as you indicated, a devastating message to say that the laws will not be enforced. It is a challenging prospect, because the reality is that half of the commission doesn't really want to see the laws enforced. Half of the commission doesn't really want to see the laws enforced.
The Federal Election Campaign Act had 4 important pieces, just to summarize.
A, it updated the disclosure laws so that we would know, again, where the money is coming from. It put in place spending limits, so it put in place reasonable limits as to how much candidates could spend on behalf of their campaigns. It also put in place contribution limits, and it also set up a system of public financing for presidential candidates that worked for a number of years, a number of decades, and then finally it set up the Federal Election Commission to enforce these new laws.
So you had those four important aspects with the Federal Election Campaign Act, and that creates the modern framework of today's campaign finance system.
But the point was, money was having an undue influence over government decisions. It was leading to corruption. Congress acted, it passed the law.
But over time, little things started to happen that started to chip away at the Federal Election Campaign Act.
That law was challenged in court, and that decision was Buckley v. Vallejo, which struck down parts of those post-Watergate reforms. Namely, it struck down spending limits.
If a group outside of the campaign that never coordinated with a candidate, never coordinated with a candidate's campaign organization, the court said that's different. And they said that in the absence of that coordination, this independence that existed, where the group stayed outside of the candidate's campaign, that money, say, spent on a television ad would qualify as what we call an independent expenditure. And independent expenditures did not have the potential to corrupt. And as a result, there was a First Amendment issue, because those independent expenditures would go to buy things like advertisements, notably television ads.
But what Buckley really did was it set up a distinction between spending money on behalf of political campaigns and contributing to political campaigns. And what the court in Buckley said was Congress and states could not prohibit a candidate from spending an unlimited amount of money in politics. But it could put in place reasonable limits as to how much an individual gives to a candidate, because that brings with it the risk of corruption and undue influence.
Buckley versus Vallejo is one of the first and most important Supreme Court cases in the modern campaign finance era,
in which the court addressed an attempt by Congress to create comprehensive campaign finance reform.
Was they ruled that campaign contributions, a direct, say I was writing a check out to a political candidate, that would be a direct contribution. And if it was large enough, it would have the potential to corrupt that elected official.
I think people are under the impression that the corruption only involves somebody handing over a check and getting a favor, and that's not the case.
Corruption has been long understood by the Supreme Court as guarding against undue access, undue influence that large donors will receive in exchange for their political contributions.
In the 1970s, legal scholarship seemed to move away from this definition. In fact, seemed to forget what our founding fathers had written into law and into regulation to prevent corruption.
The 1976 Supreme Court case, Buckley v. Vallejo, has been interpreted as explicitly limiting the scope of what constitutes corruption, effectively disregarding any other form of corruption other than bribery, which was already illegal.
The Supreme Court has a very strange definition of corruption. It defines it as only quid pro quo.
It's taken corruption from being understood as undue access and undue influence to basically just saying you can't have bribery. We need these laws in place to guard against quid pro quo.
The first dangerous move that we saw was after Watergate.
So Congress then attempted to create a fairly comprehensive campaign finance reform, and that begins the modern era of the Supreme Court's interpretation of the First Amendment and applying it to campaign finance.
The court says government may not regulate the expenditures because that kind of regulation cuts too close to the heart of political speech.
The court in Buckley versus Vallejo made a distinction between direct campaign contributions and independent expenditures, which is spending to call for the election or defeat of a candidate without officially coordinating with the candidate's campaign. According to the court, unlimited spending to ensure a candidate's victory or failure does not have sufficient corrupting influence for the government to step in.
But what the decision essentially said was that money is the equivalent of speech, and therefore spending money to influence political campaigns would be protected by the First Amendment.
Any independent expenditure was not corruptive and therefore a form of speech. And because it's a form of speech, any limits placed on that would be a limit on the First Amendment.
The application of the First Amendment to campaign finance is a post-Watergate phenomenon, post-1976 phenomenon.
While the Buckley decision expanded the interpretation of the First Amendment, it was still not applied to corporations. Limiting the flow of money in politics was upheld by the court on the basis of preventing corruption, or even the appearance of it.
The court there said disclosure is not enough to protect the political system. These contribution limits are important. So that's what we have in that decision, Buckley v. Vallejo. And it's also important to keep in mind that at the time, corporations were still prohibited from spending money to influence elections. This was all about individuals.
Who also have said they think corporations should be entitled to exactly the same status as individuals with respect to their participation in the political process.
Is it possible that organizations, particularly corporate organizations, may have some entitlements to First Amendment freedoms?
Are corporations entitled to the same First Amendment free speech and associational rights that individuals are?
The roots of constitutional rights of corporations goes back to the beginning of the 19th century. Over the course of time, the Supreme Court, in several different cases, began expanding the constitutional protection of corporate entities.
I should say that back a century ago, when corporate personhood was being established by courts and lawyers, there was a lot of objection to it, and the objection came from conservatives.
The ruling in Buckley v. Vallejo asserted that spending money is the equivalent of speech. 2 years later, in another landmark case between First National Bank of Boston and Bilotti, the justices had to decide whether or not corporations could utilize the implications of the ruling in Buckley to influence certain aspects of the political process. In other words, does the First Amendment that now protects spending money apply to corporations?
The Bilotti decision came up where the court for the first time found a First Amendment right for corporations to spend an unlimited amount in ballot initiative campaigns.
When American corporations began to push it in front of the Supreme Court with decisions like Buckley versus Vallejo and First National Bank versus Bilotti, decisions that essentially expanded the rights of corporations based on the idea that they were persons.
And the court there said, well, yes, we said that contribution limits you can limit contribution limits because it brings a risk of corruption, i.e. bribery. You can't bribe a ballot question, therefore corporations can spend an unlimited amount of money on ballot questions. People can question whether that reasoning is right or not, but that's one of the first times where this prohibition on corporate political spending was struck down.
The newest addition to the Supreme Court at the time, Lewis Powell, wrote the majority opinion and was a deciding vote in the Bilotti case. Less than 5 months before joining the Supreme Court, after being nominated by President Nixon, Powell wrote a memo to the Chamber of Commerce.
Done it, I'd urge you to take a look on the internet at a very significant memorandum by Lewis Powell.
Well, the Powell memo was written by Justice Lewis Powell. He wrote it at the urging of his friend Eugene Sydnor at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Powell was a corporate lobbyist, later appointed to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon, and he wrote a very important memorandum, very influential memorandum, I think 1971.
He was writing about what he perceived an attack on business.
The memo called for a big business kind of corporate makeover of government. And he wrote in very strident terms. He really felt like the memo was entitled Attack on American Free Enterprise.
And what he told the Chamber of Commerce is, he said, the entire free enterprise system, the basis of our liberty, is under attack. The universities, the media, the government have all been taken over, literally. It's very paranoid, but it reflects the attitude. They've been taken over by left-wing extremists who are going to destroy our freedoms.
And in '76, he authored the Buckley versus Vallejo decision, in which they concluded that spending money to buy politicians or promote or destroy politicians was not an activity, that it was actually speech protected under the First Amendment. It wasn't an activity that can be regulated.
This memo did not become publicly available until after Richard Nixon appointed Powell to the Supreme Court of the United States.
In the memo, Powell advocated for increased corporate involvement to influence the Supreme Court, calling it an important instrument to accomplish political change, saying, quote, American business and the enterprise system have been affected as much by the courts as by the executive and legislative branches of government. Under our constitutional system, especially with an activist-minded Supreme Court, the judiciary may be the most important instrument for social, economic, and political change. In addition, Powell urged for constant surveillance of national television networks and academic textbooks. He called for no hesitation to attack his ideological opponents, as well as offering incentives to entice independent scholars to publish material that aligned with Powell's political stance. In Powell's case, we see a judge stepping on the bench less than 5 months after officially advocating for actively influencing the Supreme Court. And within 7 years of his appointment, 2 of the most important cases in campaign finance history is decided, laying the groundwork for further deregulation and the infamous Citizens United decision.
If you had it all to do over again, would you still go for McCain-Feingold?
Absolutely. You've seen the corruption in Washington. We have former members of Congress in federal prison. The approval rating of Congress is down around 11%.
The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, as the name suggests, was an effort across party lines to restore public trust in the political process. It attempted to close the soft money loophole and redefine what an issue ad is.
After McCain-Feingold passed, some provisions were immediately struck down by the Supreme Court after a lawsuit from a U.S. senator who's very against campaign finance reform.
The law is immediately challenged by Mitch McConnell, our current Senate Majority Leader, and Mitch McConnell goes to court and loses. So in 2004, the court upholds the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. And to most reformers, they thought, well, this is it. The matter is settled. We've fixed the major problems with the law. There may be a few others, but this is a huge improvement from where we were at the end of the 1990s. And it seemed that campaign finance law was largely settled after the McConnell case in 2004. And then we get the Roberts Court, and then everything changes.
Five years ago today, the Supreme Court handed down a decision in the Citizens United case, dramatically changing the political landscape.
You mentioned the Supreme Court, and the term started today with the campaign finance case that sort of picks up where Citizens United left off. We've called Citizens United devastating to the public interest.
FEC Commissioner Ellen Weintraub recently wrote a piece in the New York Times headlined, "Taking on Citizens United."
Citizens United.
Citizens United.
Citizens United.
Citizens United.
For reversing Citizens United.
We had the 5th year anniversary of Citizens United a couple of days ago.
When it comes to getting money out of politics, the American people are more united than on perhaps any other issue. 78% of those responding said that the Citizens United ruling should be overturned.
Citizens United was a political organization. In fact, they had a political action committee. They had spent time in previous elections going after Al Gore, going after John Kerry. But what they wanted to do in the 2008 election was to produce a documentary film about Hillary Clinton.
In 2008, Citizens United produced a film called Hillary the Movie.
I mean, the movie was funded, produced by Citizens United, a conservative group.
The Supreme Court heard arguments about whether the movie amounted to a campaign ad. That's leading to a ruling on whether there should be any limits on campaign spending by corporations and labor unions.
The court in Citizens United could have ruled on narrow grounds, deciding whether or not the film violated current regulation. Instead, the court addressed a broader, constitutional question, which led to allowing corporations to spend an unlimited amount of money influencing elections. The decision marks an era in which the American people have low confidence in the pinnacle of the judicial system. In fact, in 2014, only 30% of Americans had confidence in the Supreme Court, a 26% difference compared to in 1988. The public perceives the High Court as politicized, where the justice's political affiliation is now a striking indicator of the outcome of a case. This became clear when the ideological majority of the court shifted a few years prior to Citizens United.
At
that point, there had been a switch in the Supreme Court. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor had left the court. Justice Alito had joined the court.
When she sat on the court, Justice O'Connor supported limits on money in elections. Justice Alito, who succeeded her, tipped what was then a 5-4 balance that with O'Connor had been in favor of those limits to 5-4 against limits on corporate and union independent spending.
Justice Rehnquist had passed away. Justice Roberts took the place as the Chief Justice.
As Judge Roberts prepares to lead the judicial branch of government, all Americans can be confident that the 17th Chief Justice of the United States will be prudent in exercising judicial power. So help me God.
The 5 conservative justices currently sitting on the United States Supreme Court are among the 10 most conservative in over half a century. And Justices Alito and Roberts, number 1 and number 2.
So there are these studies that show that the Roberts Court is ruling of corporations at a higher percentage than any court, going back to like the 1920s. It's an enormous social problem because you've had a lot of laws that were really important to protecting the consumers, to protecting workers, that have been effectively erased by companies just deciding that they don't want to be held accountable by them.
And of course, the most well-known and most significant of cases in the Roberts Court was the 2010 Citizens United versus FEC, Federal Election Commission case.
And Citizens United then overturned all of those earlier decisions that had upheld McCain-Feingold and had upheld laws prohibiting corporate political spending all the way back to 1907, and basically invented this new right for corporations to spend an unlimited amount of money influencing political campaigns.
It is a jolt to the legal system when you overrule a precedent. Precedent plays an important role in promoting stability and even-handedness. It is not enough, and the court has emphasized this on several occasions, it is not enough that you may think the prior decision was wrongly decided. That really doesn't answer.
Yet in the Citizens United decision last year, the Roberts Court overturned a century of election law in America to affirm that money is a form of free speech and declare that corporations, both domestic and foreign, can spend unlimited amounts of their corporate treasure chests to influence American elections.
And Citizens United is the best known because the terms of it are so stark that corporations should be allowed to spend unlimited amounts of money influencing our elections.
Those who like this decision say it's a victory for free speech. Those who don't say campaigns will now be drowning in corporate cash and influence.
The decision in a subsequent case between SpeechNow.org and the Federal Elections Commission relied on the ruling in Citizens United. The outcome was the creation of super PACs.
One of the other consequences to come out of the Citizens United ruling is the emergence of what we call super PACs.
Citizens United established as a principle that corporations and unions can spend an unlimited amount of money calling for the election or defeat of candidates.
A group, SpeechNow.org, raised the question in court, what if we create a political action committee that never makes a campaign contribution, that only does independent expenditures? What about a group like that?
The plaintiffs in that case said if we're allowed to spend an unlimited amount of money advocating for the election or defeat of candidates, can't we pool our money together and spend it on behalf of candidates?
That group would have, based on the court's logic and rationale, no potential to corrupt. And in the absence of no potential to corrupt, there would be no justification for any rules or restrictions on those groups.
Citizens United, in tandem with SpeechNow, gave us our current system of super PACs.
Super PACs enable corporations, unions, and wealthy individuals to pool their resources together and influence the political process. The result of their emergence was a massive increase in outside spending.
So super PACs are, yes, they're the result of Citizens United, but they're really also the result of SpeechNow. Citizens United said, again, you can spend an unlimited amount of money out of your corporate treasury to elect or defeat candidates. SpeechNow said, hey, all of you corporations and wealthy millionaires and billionaires and others, you can now pool those resources and spend them together.
But because these super PACs can raise unlimited amounts of money, and things like TV ads are really expensive, they become a very effective way for interests to funnel in lots and lots of money and influence these elected officials.
Look at how it exploded in 2010 when the Citizens United decision was made. In presidential elections, the numbers are even worse. Under Citizens United, outside spending exploded to just over $1.2 billion in the last election.
And the rule was there could be no coordination with the candidates and the candidates' campaign.
However, this rule is often skirted.
And while we say there's no coordination, the law does allow a candidate to raise money for their super PAC. So in our mind, this rule about no coordination is weak and really not, I guess, relevant, because we see all kinds of coordination happening, and it just has, again, propelled unbelievable amounts of money now into the political campaign system that is really hard to think about how we get our arms around solving until Citizens United is overturned.
So super PACs have obviously become a really, really significant player in the process.
In addition to super PACs, so-called 501c4 groups have become increasingly popular. IRS regulations exempts these groups from disclosing their donors. The number of 501c4s increased after Citizens United, and so did their spending in the political process.
And then there are 501c4s, social welfare groups. And they're a lot like super PACs, except the money is secret.
And the 501c4 organization, like any of the 501c's that I've mentioned, can accept unlimited donations and not have to disclose the names of their donors.
C4s can openly support or oppose candidates and ballot issues. This activity just can't be the primary reason for the organization's existence.
But their primary purpose is supposed to be social welfare. So it's supposed to be improving the community's good. So these groups have to make an argument that they're spending the bulk of their resources on improving the public good, not just using it as a way to funnel anonymous money into politics.
According to the IRS, political activities may not be their primary purpose, but enforcement is lagging, and regulations are left ambiguous. 501c4s are regulated under the premise of promoting social welfare, but have increasingly donated to super PACs. This allows the groups to anonymously get more money into politics and increasingly affect the outcome of elections.
Citizens United happened, and sophisticated political operatives figured out that, hey, there is this corporate entity we can set up. We can set it up under our nonprofit laws and funnel the money through that entity into other, organizations on behalf of candidates and political campaigns.
A super PAC, however, can give 100% of its money to partisan political activities. So what you can do is take a really, really wealthy donor who has lots of money, and he can give to a 501c4 that's been set up, a shell corporation, right? Nobody knows who they are because they don't disclose their name. Shell corporation can then take, let's say it was a $5 million contribution, and take $5 million and then give it to a super PAC. Now, the Federal Election Commission does require disclosure of all super PAC donations. But what would they disclose? They wouldn't disclose the identity of the donor who gave the original $5 million to the 501c4. Instead, they would report the donation as coming from Shell Corporation.
I don't think people make that distinction, unfortunately, either. I think whether it's television ads or polling or just any kind of campaigning, I'm not certain that the average citizen can understand, oh, that's a commercial that's from an independent entity versus that's for a candidate.
Advertisers are supposed to disclose the true identity of their ads. And what we've seen are a number of super PACs putting commercials up on the air saying this is paid for by Americans for Purple Mountain Majesties, and the voters don't know who on earth that is.
These are very dangerous because we don't know where the money is coming from.
If there's a billionaire who's airing a political ad and hiding behind a benign sounding name, we deserve to know the true identity behind that name.
So Shell Corporation would show up in the reports. Well, that would be meaningless to most of us. We would say, well, who is Shell Corporation and who finances it? And the truth is, nobody would know because there would be no disclosure requirement to the 501c4 organization.
In the majority opinion in Citizens United, Justice Anthony Kennedy argued that prompt disclosure allows citizens to make informed decisions about candidates. But the logic and rationale have been criticized because of existing loopholes and lack of sufficient disclosure requirements. In the upcoming years, legislation aimed at updating disclosure laws have been blocked by the Senate.
One of the things is disclosure.
Yes.
You live in this cyber age. You don't need to wait for 3 months after the election for a report on who gave the money. It can be done in 24 hours. If the voters don't like the people who are funding you, don't vote for them.
So
that's not working the way it should. But.
Right, exactly. If I could have a follow-up, your opinion says rightly there can be disclosure and we have the technology to do it, but we have a political logjam. So the FEC, the FCC, the SEC all have the authority to require the disclosure of campaign contributions, and none of them have. So,
and it goes back to, we have this hostile, fractious dialogue. Look at the names of some of our TV shows. Hardball, Crossfire. We have to change things. Well, I see people are leaving. You asked about traveling.
One part of Citizens United that had 8 votes and the American people, I think, support is disclosure.
And in fact, if you read Citizens United in the ruling, the disclosure requirements were challenged, and the court actually sided with the reformers on that and said, no, the disclosure requirements are fine and they're constitutional and they remain on the books.
Well, there's now going to be money in politics from corporations. Shareholders, citizens will be able to hold political spenders accountable and politicians accountable because they'll be able to follow the money and see if their elected officials are in the pocket of so-called moneyed interests.
The justices said, well, there will be disclosure and so it'll be okay. Well, the disclosure that they were asking for hasn't even become the reality.
It is certainly a serious issue in this country when we don't seem to have a way of addressing big money politics other than perhaps pushing for a little bit more sunshine, i.e. transparency.
We have not updated our disclosure laws. We don't know where, as I said, over $500 million came from. Nearly 1/3 of the money in the 2012 and 2014 elections came from secret sources.
However, I will say, while disclosure is a good thing and we all believe in it, it doesn't seem to be solving the problem.
Would full disclosure change anything? Not really.
So we've got to fix those laws so that we can follow the money. And ultimately, we've really got to change the way that the court approaches our money in politics laws, our campaign finance laws. For too long, they've viewed it through a lens of corruption and bribery, which we have laws against, and they've ignored kind of concepts of political equality. That is, that we all come to participate in politics as equals. We all have one vote, irrespective of our station in society.
We worry that some citizens are going to have better access to the system, that they're going to have better access to the ear of the representative, that they're going to be able to make their case in a way and given more time to make their case or access to make their case in ways that ordinary citizens won't and don't.
Now, according to the court's logic, people can spend as much money as they want because it's independent of campaigns, and campaigns and candidates won't be responsive to money that's independent because it didn't flow through their bank account. They're not going to feel any debt of gratitude. That's the court's logic.
I'm talking about giving a gift to somebody who makes a decision on behalf of the public. At the end of the day, that's really what bribery is, but it is done every day.
I think most people and most candidates know very well that whether the money goes directly to their campaign or whether it's spent so-called independently, those candidates are going to owe a debt of gratitude to anybody spending money on their behalf, saying vote for this person or vote against that person.
In the Federalist Papers defending our Constitution, it said we need a Congress dependent on the people alone and not the rich more than the poor.
We have a system in this country where half of 1% of the American population is responsible for 60% of political contributions.
In the lobbying world, we don't have one person, one vote. We have lobbying capacity associated with financial capacity.
And I think the question that we have to ask as Americans is whether this type of inequality in this system is something that we are willing to put up with.
There's huge percentages of the American public that simply are not part of the lobbying game.
Maybe we ought to think about equality and campaign financing to assure that everybody's voice gets heard.
It's pretty straightforward. Structure determines function. If we want the function of our government to be for the people, then the structure of the elections need to work for the people.
Do you think it's possible for regular citizens to get involved on the same scale?
No. I would love to say that I have a magic solution, but it's not possible.
So today, the Supreme Court handed down yet another atrocious decision.
Next up is oral argument in the case McCutcheon v. FEC. This dealt with a wealthy Republican donor in Alabama who challenged overall limits to political contributions.
The McCutcheon decision was kind of the sequel to Citizens United. It was brought by a wealthy Republican businessman in the South who wanted to max out and give thousands and thousands of dollars to as many candidates as he wanted.
Alabama political donor Sean McCutcheon is challenging the limits on campaign contributions, which are currently $2,600 to single candidates and an overall limit of $123,000 per election cycle.
We're going to hear the conflict between free speech and efforts to end political corruption. The FEC in this case stands for the Federal Election Commission, which implemented the rules following a campaign finance reform law passed in the 1970s. They imposed several types of limits. One is on what you can give to a candidate, and the other, which is at stake in this case, is the aggregate limit, the total amount you can give across all federal candidates.
The Supreme Court struck down that overall contribution limit and essentially said that anybody can write a check of up to $3.5 million to a party's political candidates.
Now, let me give you a sense of how small that community is, right? So 650 donors contributed the maximum amount to candidates, PACs, and parties in the last election cycle. So now those guys will get to put in even more money because now there is no maximum.
So that's what happened in McCutcheon. It really gets into the weeds of our contribution limit system. It really gets into the weeds of our campaign finance laws. But what people need to know is what it really means is it vastly increased the amount of money in politics.
Now, continuing with the number of people that give money to political campaigns. For people giving $200, that's only 0.26% of Americans. Well, you can give the maximum of $2,600 to a candidate. Now, of course, because of the McCutcheon decision, you could multiply that by every candidate in the country, then give unlimited amounts to the parties, right? But that's 0.05% of Americans, and they decided elections before. Now they have even more power and more voice. How about people giving $10,000 in campaign donations? That's the 0.01% of Americans, and $100,000, that's 0.00024% of Americans. And those are the guys who are now empowered because there is no cap left. Unlimited amount of money in politics. Okay, now,
some people think public financing is bad because it's just what they say is taxpayer-funded campaigns. But when you think about it, we the people own the election system. We pay for the polling places, we pay for the voting machines, we pay for the employees who are working the elections, the State Board of Elections. That's ours, it's our democracy. What's the danger in the public's money going to also help fund the campaigns? And who would we rather see fund the campaigns, the people, or again, wealthy special interests that we don't even know their identities?
You know, in the Old South, we used to have something called the white primary, where they said African Americans were not allowed to vote in the Democratic primary. And the reason they did that is they knew that if you control the primary, you effectively control the general election, because you've got to get through the hurdle of whites in the primary. Even if you're elected, you're not going to do anything to help African Americans. Well, we don't have a white primary in America anymore. We have a green primary. Because right now, their focus is on what the funders of campaigns care about. And the solution to the white primary is the solution to the green primary. With the white primary, the solution is everybody can vote, regardless of race. And with the green primary, the solution is to make everybody is participating in the funding of campaigns.
The primary issue is that as Americans, we like to think that we have one person, one vote, and we have a government that's associated with that philosophical concept. You know, every voice can be heard. And what lobbying creates is a system where some of us are silent and some of us have a megaphone. And the megaphone, the size of the megaphone and the amount of speech is associated with the amount of money available. And so I think that part is inconsistent with any set of democratic values that anybody would claim to represent.
It's gotten out of hand in our eyes because it limits greatly the people who can legitimately consider running for office. To be a candidate in this day and age, you either have to be wealthy, you have to have connections to wealthy sources, or just be an incredible fundraiser.
The solution is to pass laws that ensure that our elections are being financed primarily by small donors, not by big special interest donors.
We think that we should have small donor public financing systems, again, where average, ordinary people can run for office, irrespective of whether they themselves are wealthy and have deep pockets or whether they're connected to wealthy friends.
So whenever you're talking about something like public funding that's going to really bring out more candidates, allow voters to have more choices,
they should be able to run for office, and voters should be able to elect candidates who are responsive, again, to the problems of the day, that can run on the merits of their ideas and not on the size of their bank account.
We know that one of the main obstacles for working class people is concerns about raising money. And what I find at the state level is exactly the same, that states that publicly finance elections have more working class candidates running.
Every voter would have a voucher that they can use to fund campaigns. They give it to candidates who are willing to fund their campaigns with these vouchers and maybe small contributions as well. But the point is, if you're a member of Congress raising money in small contributions from thousands of people, then your behavior is going to be different from if you're a member of Congress raising large contributions from a tiny fraction of the people. And so I think that's the essence of the solution we've got to find a way to get.
Thank you very much.
Great, thanks.
Over the next few weeks, activists from all over the country will join together in a massive march on Washington, D.C. called the Democracy Spring. Their goal? To get Congress to take action on getting money out of politics.
Democracy Spring? Yeah, Democracy Spring is going to be a series of actions that are going to take place in here the spring of 2016. There's going to be some groups, 99 Rise and Avaz, are taking the lead role in organizing a march from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C.
Thousands of people are expected to participate in the march and the sit-in that will follow it, which could end up being the largest civil disobedience event in decades.
There's going to be a number of actions, a number of teach-ins. We expect thousands and thousands of people to come to Washington, D.C. and to show up and rally and march for our democracy. So you're going to, again, see, I think, a lot of action in the spring. You're going to see some actions of civil disobedience, and you're going to see other ways to really raise the volume so that people on Capitol Hill know that their voters are watching them.
My name is Kai Newkirk. I'm the campaign director for Democracy Spring, and here we are on the outskirts of DC, day 8 of our march. We started in Philadelphia last Saturday, April 2nd, we gathered at the Liberty Bell, which is symbolic of our aspirations to democracy as a country. And we rallied there in the rain and we proclaimed our vision and our cause and our demand to Congress that they need to listen to the people and take immediate action to end this corruption of big money in politics and ensure that we have free and fair elections that give all of us an equal voice. And we said that if they don't do it, if they won't lift a finger to save our democracy by the time that we get to D.C., that we will have no choice but to sit in non-violently, peacefully, and reclaim the people's house, force them to decide whether to do their job and listen to the people and save our democracy, or to send us all to jail and send a message to the country about where this Congress stands on the side of corruption or whether they're with the people.
When hope is in bloom, spring is coming. Make some room, 'cause freedom is growing. When love is in bloom.
So we built some community together, did we not? Yeah. And now we're here, and we were the 150 or 250 that were trying to lead this thing, and tomorrow we're gonna have 1,500 or 2,500, or we don't really know. What we do know is we have over 1,000 confirmed on the phone telling us that they will risk arrest, that they will stand up for their
The consequence of the money corrupting politics is overwhelming. It affects almost every single issue.
Money ain't free, corporations are people. Money ain't free, corporations are people.
Fighting money in politics is so important because it's the center of every issue. We can't move forward on anything else until we combat money in politics.
This is the 6th day that people have come back and said that we're not going to leave until Congress does something to save our democracy, to end the corruption of big money in politics, and ensure free and fair elections that give us all an equal voice. And day after day, rather than listen to the vast majority of the American people who want this change, they've decided to send people to jail. Over 1,000 people now have been arrested here at the People's House, saying that we are going to disrupt business as usual. We demand a democracy that works for us all, a government of, by, and for the people, not just the 1%.
Part of Democracy Spring because right now we don't have a government that represents the people. We have a government that is bought and paid for by billionaires and corporations, and if we want to make progress on any of the fights that we care about, whether that's education, healthcare, climate change, wealth and income inequality, mass incarceration, all of these fights are linked back to the fact that our government works for the wealthy few, not the vast majority. So if we want to change that, it takes people power. It takes people demanding an equal voice. It takes people actually taking nonviolent direct action to raise this issue into the public consciousness and to force politicians to change their behavior and to have a political cost associated with inaction.
It's beautiful to see so many people here. I mean, well, obviously, like a true political revolution takes more than standing together, chanting and waving signs. what this has accomplished is get an incredible amount of media attention online and on TV and in newspapers. So more people are paying attention to this. Like, we've broken through. This movement has reached new levels of public awareness and support, realizing that this is, the people are rising up. So this is important because it's going to catalyze, a new generation of people to get involved in the hard work that's involved in actually passing reform, whether that's electing reformers and holding them accountable to pass reform or supporting ballot measures. Like, this is kicking it all off. This is the inciting event of the political revolution. So this is key.